Welcome everyone to our seminar, Art, Political Culture and Civic Life. We're gathered here together on Zoom. We usually gather in person around a dinner table and actually have dinner. So we want you to feel as comfortable, as casual, as informal, as if we were gathered at a dinner table. And what we're going to do today, in contrast to what is done on television, in which we have an incessant barrage of 24/7 news, we want to deepen the conversation. We want to think about where do we go from here? We don't want to lose contact with history and with memory. So I'd like to begin by calling on some of our participants from around the world to give us a 1 minute, 1.5 minute You Are There report from where they are located. So first I would like to go to London, England, to Gwyn Williams, who for many years has headed BBC Radio 4 to report from London. Just unmute, Gwyn. Unmute.
Dear, hello from London. I wish we were at your dinner table, Kiku. Well, picture the scene here. It's November the 5th, the day after your election, and COVID deaths in the UK are about to reach 50,000. That's the highest in Europe. We're about to head into our second lockdown. Brexit looms over everything. Deal, no deal. All we know is if it's a deal, it'll be a bad one. But we're gathered, COVID rules allowing, in the garden. David, my husband's cooking an American barbecue, short ribs, pecan pie, cocktails, etc. We've got flags. And there we are huddled. The American lawyer with us has a Constitution copy in his pocket. So as if things aren't bad enough, we've now got to look over the ocean at you Americans. You Americans who've given us 4 years of chaos, coarse, dreadful, anxiety-enhancing public discourse. And it's just brought out the worst in all of our leaders here. And this is the thing really I wanted to highlight in this quick minute, is that when we were in Boston for the primaries, we were struck or hit, really shocked by the anger, the rage, the sort of venom around your election. The thing is, you Americans are so angry. And anger is such an extraordinarily negative thing. Populism thrives in it. It allows us to demonize people who disagree with us. We can't listen. We can't acknowledge our own mistakes. It looks as if Biden certainly has disdained anger in the course of his campaign. And over here in the UK, Keir Starmer, our opposition leader, seems to be taking the same tack. And I just wanted to quote from an FT columnist that we like very much called Robert Shrimsley. He quotes Johnny Rotten from the Sex Pistols, who says that anger is an energy and it's addictive. So my question really that I want to throw out today is, can the US go forward in the next 4 years without anger? But more, do you want to? Thank you.
Thanks, Gwyn. Next, I want to call on Bukola Adebayo, who is now 2 weeks in the US, but she's based in Lagos. And she is a senior producer for CNN in Lagos and in charge of African breaking news. And she's here with us because she's a Nieman Fellow. So Bukola, take it away.
Thanks, Kiko, for that great introduction. Like she said, I came into Cambridge 2 weeks ago. I was in Lagos. And in Nigeria, we've been having weeks and weeks of protests on the streets. Young people in Nigeria, citizens generally, they are protesting police brutality. They're saying we can no longer take harassment from the police, institutions that are meant to protect us. And this sort of demonstration also resonates with what was happening in the US. exactly before the elections, the Black Lives Matter, which came to bear again because of the killing of George Floyd. And there's a lot of racial reckoning in the US, and that also sort of filtered into what was going on in Nigeria about police brutality. But it has since morphed into some sort of demonstration just to push the government to look at all aspects of life, welfare of citizens, and just look at citizens have now, the protests have morphed into a language of just saying, we want this sort of corruption, we want accountability. And it also resonates with what is happening, I would say, in Hong Kong. It also resonates with also what is happening in the US, well, before the whole election news circle sort of like covered it up. And my question would be, how can demonstrations on the streets, citizens' action and demonstration morph from the streets to real actionable points, to genuine and thoughtful programs that really filter into the lives of the people? And we are looking at, Nigerians are borrowing from a lot of lessons from the US, from Hong Kong, where they've had also a year and many months of anti-government protests against policies. And that's really my question. How do we take protests and demonstrations from the streets and into actionable action, into actionable thoughts and genuine reforms? Yeah.
That's a great question. I want to turn now to Speciosa Wandira, who from her experiences in Uganda and her early work being a student protester and organizer fighting against Idi Amin, but also the former VP of Uganda, the first woman VP in Africa, a physician, an advocate for so many important issues in terms of public health, in terms of women's rights, and many others. So Speciosa, give us a feel for what is happening right now at Pulsebeat in Kampala.
Glad to be here with you. Kampala is more or less quiet because we are having elections January the 14th next year. And we have a number of presidential candidates. So parties have had their primaries and everybody is on the move. It is somehow a contrast to the US because the Electoral Commission has given out a timetable, and Ugandans generally are trying to actually fit into that timetable and also to listen to what the Electoral Commission is saying. But of course, the young people, they are on the streets following their candidates and doing whatever they think they should do, despite the SOPs given out by the Ministry of Health. Now, as a political activist for many years, I can see that we are somehow at a watershed. And also the US is at a, it's at a watershed. Really, it has been the spokesperson of democracy pointing fingers right and left and saying, you must concede, the elections are this way, they should be like this. But Ugandans are saying, apparently, we need the observers from Uganda and the other parts of the world to observe US elections, because it appears the Americans are not different from other parts of the world. And their politicians, especially with Donald Trump, who is a comedian to many Ugandans, he's just playing out what it is that is in the mind of a very good section of Americans. So we can now see the tribalism in America. And, when you look at how the voting went, you can see that the midsection of America is following Trump. And then the periphery, which is more, which is, it has more, it is not as, it is more heterogeneous, is on the other side and don't like what Trump is doing. So I would also want to say that the effect of what is happening in America with Trump refusing, as per tradition, to do what the Americans have been doing, that is to concede defeat when everything else is pointing into that direction, also emboldens, people in Africa to say, I'm not going to accept those results. It's in Uganda, you can see that Ugandans are saying America is no different from any country in Africa which is going through the elections. So my question would be, given the current situation with respect to COVID, when every country is challenged in a similar way, no jobs for the young people, the government budgets are strained, movement is curtailed. So when you have freedoms to do whatever one wants to do, and also some of the human rights have been put in cupboards because of COVID, where are we going to go with respect to saying that political freedoms are a given? People have a right to move and actually canvass for votes and talk to people. But also, I would like to ask on the part of America, where is America going really? Because it is apparent that there's a lot of ignorance in America, with respect to what democracy is all about and what the general direction of what the country should do to retain leadership in the world. So it's saying, are we really up to it if we can't do it for ourselves? And this has been portrayed throughout Trump's presidency. So those are my two concerns, because many people think politics is for politicians, but it percolates in everybody's life, in every way. And how do we actually get people to understand this and really engage with the facts to be able to elect leaders with agendas that answer to the needs of the people, to ensure that every country is respected up to where it can achieve those standards. Thank you.
No, excellent, Speciosa. Many really important questions to put on the table. Now I'd like to go to Madrid, to Cody Asarin, a microbiologist, holistic therapist, and we first met her as a journalist. Cody.
Yeah. How are you? Thank you for having me here. I'm so happy to be here. And I'll try to explain a little bit what's the situation here in Spain. Those of you that know Spanish life, you must know that in Spain, and especially in Madrid, people were living outside of home. Bars, cafeterias, social gathering, bistro, cafe, restaurant, it's the main life here for the Spanish people. I say that because to take all of this before and during the quarantine and pandemic, it was very hard, emotionally, very, very hard for Spanish life. And what happened with COVID, I think it's two very important things. One of them is the fear of contagious. People are taken away, are living separated of their loved ones, with no bars, no going outside, with the uncertainty what will happen. And in the economy, we must know that for Spain, in Spain, tourism, it was the main source of income. So we are seeing every day stores closing and people don't know what will happen. About American elections, I feel that before COVID, it was like the most important decision, not only for American states, but also for all the world. And I feel that after COVID-19, it's like COVID-19 threw the American election to the second row. Now people are worried about how to live, how to get out of this, what will happen with young people, no job, no, all this uncertainty, even for the immunization about the vaccine. Everyone is saying another theory. And the belief here is no Trump, no the other one, no president knows what to do. And the most important thing, how there is someone that knows how to get out from here. So the taste here is sadness, worry, and a little bit, I was telling, disappointment, because we were looking at the states like Big Brother. No matter what will happen, they know what to do, and scientific society will know what to do. And there is like a little bit a taste of disappointment. They don't know what to do.
No. Thank you, Koti. Now I want to go to Adriana Gutierrez, who is born and raised in Mexico City and spends a lot of time there. Of course, the pandemic kept her from the travel. She usually goes back home to speak to us about the pulse beat in Mexico City, in Mexico more generally. Adriana, who is a gifted teacher in the Romance Language and Literature Department at Harvard.
Thank you, Kiku. Well, the mood in Mexico is also dire because the COVID deaths are rising, and the government has imposed a lockdown light. So the people who can afford to stay home, they are working from home, but most people in Mexico do not have that privilege. So street vendors are on the street, they're all wearing masks, and the government has decided not to force people into their homes if they need to work outside. So the situation is not very good on the health side, and on the election front, the importance of US elections for Mexico is extremely, extremely close. Most people follow US elections because they have family in the US and vice versa. So the elections are followed very, very closely. And of course, Donald Trump the anger against Trump in general in Mexico is complete and homogeneous. So, but the president, López Obrador, who is the first leftist president ever, at least since the 19th century in Mexico, has wanted to focus on fighting corruption in Mexico, and he has done so. People look up to him, they really love him. The working class, the upper classes, not so much. So there is a huge class divide there. And López Obrador has not congratulated Biden. He belongs to a very small group of leaders in the world that still to this day has not called Biden. And the reason, his own rationale, is that he was robbed the election in 2006, and that one of the ways in which his opponent was legitimized in the elections was starting with the calls of international leaders. He says that no country should meddle in the elections of other country. And although his argument in this case is very self-serving, I think he's emphasizing and pointing out something that other participants have mentioned, and that to me is very obvious, that what is happening now in the US has promoted elsewhere all the time, and very closely in Mexico. The US has decided and forced by elections on one side or the other. And now López Obrador seems to be saying, well, do you want us to legitimize your democracy when your work has been to undo the democracy in other parts of the world? So I think Mexico is conflicted. Again, literally half of Mexicans have family in the US, and they are also divided. But so my question would be to echo Lopez Obrador's question. How can the US defend or go back to a real functioning democracy when their role in the world has been so instrumental in undoing democracies?
Wow. Thank you, Adriana. Very powerful question. And all of these we want to weave into our discussion. Next, Sergio Imparato. He's here in the States as a political philosopher and award-winning teacher at Harvard. But he's going to report from his hometown, Naples, Italy.
Thank you, Kiko. Hi, everyone. The situation in Italy, as in other countries, of course, is very much focused on the COVID response. And inevitably, because of the endemic corruption and ineffectiveness of the Italian government, we tend to see our government as being unable to respond to health crisis. But we usually look at the American government as one of those governments who is capable and functioning in situations like this. This past experiences, this last few years, have showed us that that is not the case. And in a way, it also influenced our politics, because in the past few years, Italy has had a populist government which ran on the idea that incompetence is a virtue in politics. And very recently, we had local elections where there was a huge rebuke of populism in Italy. And some argue that was because, in a way, we saw how populism did not work in the United States, where we would expect it to work in responding to COVID. And so my question is, to what extent American populism and the failure of American populism will have an effect on populist governments around the world?
Thank you, Sergio. Again, great questions. And I go to our last and very special reporter, Cynthia McCauley from Panama City, Florida, in the heart of Trump country. Cynthia is the director of the Chautauqua Charter School and one of the most innovative leaders in the world today on pathways for people with disabilities, creative pathways. So she often takes her students around the world and they do all of these incredible projects. So Cynthia, unmute and tell us what's the pulse beat in Panama City on the Panhandle?
The pulse beat. This is an area that voted for Trump overwhelmingly, at least 75% in Bay County. Counties north of here, much higher. It's an area, I love this town, but it's challenging at times. Just north of us is a place called Marianna. Any of you who maybe read Colson Whitehead's book, The Nickel Boys, it's Marianna, Florida. They just recently integrated their schools, literally, by federal court order. 2018 integrated the schools. This was the site, I know it's breathtaking, isn't it? It was the site of the largest plantation in Florida, and I just feel like some of that spell remains. The rebel flag is far more common than Black Lives Matter t-shirts. And here the people are angry. They feel like the election was stolen. At my little school, I see staff on their phones. They're very drawn to this one network, One America News Network. They cite that. And their faces are red with anger. They just really think that there's some conspiracy has taken Trump, trying to take Trump from them. And what's interesting is, I know they're looking for hope. We have gone through a Category 5 hurricane here. It devastated homes, businesses, the tourism industry, the source of economy, Tyndall Air Force Base, was completely wiped out. So that was 2018 in October. Kids were out of school, no water, no electricity for months, and then the pandemic. So before the election, people were resisting masks. They felt like this was just a hoax, resisting. And now, since the election, and these ideas that liberals have stolen it, people don't wear a mask as a badge of honor. They think it's a liberal hoax, and they're very proud to not wear a mask because they're not standing with we liberals. So it's difficult for me because I love everybody here. That's what we preach at Chautauqua. We must love everybody. All people are good. And so I work with them. I love with them. They're my neighbors. But I told Kiko the other day, it's like looking at the sun, something so obvious as the sun, and they see something else. So that's the pulse here, and it's difficult.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cynthia. And thank you for all of our lightning reporters from different parts of the world. I think why it's important is that we don't become so US-centric, that we don't look at the rest of the world, learn from it, and situate ourselves in a larger history. So what I'd now like to turn we have four people who will begin to jumpstart the conversation, the dinner table conversation. Larry Tribe, University professor at Harvard and America's leading constitutional lawyer, who has argued and prevailed in numerous cases before the Supreme Court. Randy Kennedy, professor at the Harvard Law School, author of numerous books and articles that explore the intersection of race, politics, civil rights, and criminal law. Jim Carroll, wonderful author of 12 novels, 9 works of nonfiction, wonderful columns, a really leading voice in the US. Valerie Imperato, civil rights lawyer and artist, and an investigative Title IX coordinator at Brandeis University. And Larry, please take it away. Begin this discussion, this deeper discussion and exploration of where do we go now?
Well, it's an extreme honor to be here and a great challenge to deal with this truly illuminating set of observations. From Gwen in London to Cynthia in our own Panhandle, the theme of how do we avoid profound anger is a pervasive one. Anger seems to define us these days. The anger of tribalism, but also the anger of genuine histories of injustice. In some ways, it's odd that some of the most privileged whites in the world should be as angry as they are, when the people who have the deepest reasons for anger in America probably are African Americans and Native Americans, people to whom we have done terrible things. Really similar to Adriana's question, how can the United States function as a beacon of democracy around the world when it has done so many terrible things? There is no one answer to any of these questions. Certainly I can't answer Speciosa's question, where are we going now? But the most profound thing I think we all have witnessed is the transformative potential of an election in which 160 million Americans voted. Despite the voter suppression, despite all of the intervention by foreign governments, the US Department of Homeland Security has said this was the most secure election in all of history. My hope is that a less angry administration, a Biden administration that at least in the beginning aspires to talk to everyone. When Biden says, I mean to be the president, not only for those who voted for me, but also for the people that Cynthia loves, but finds understandably hard to fathom when they look at the sun and see something very dark and very different. He means to be the president for them as well. Only time will tell if that can succeed. But it seems to me that many of the things that the observers from around the world have said focus on how far we have deviated from the hopeful trajectory on which we were moving through the Obama years. Suddenly a discontinuity. Suddenly we are no longer the beacon of hope, the beacon of democracy, the exemplar of competence, of science, of expertise. Michael has written importantly about how the fetish of expertise has to some degree alienated some people in the world and in our own country. It seems to me that right now, the most important thing is to transform the demonstrations in the street, which need to go on, but to transform them into action. The answer, I think, to the question, how can demonstration morph into action, has to be through the ballot box, through the system of elections. Our system has been remarkably durable. We really have had, despite the threat that the Booba Boys or the militias would interfere with the election, we've had a peaceful election. We will, I think, though there may be more violence, we will have a peaceful transition. The fact that it's a fact that, I guess Adriana has emphasized, Obrador has yet to congratulate Biden, equally important to some people is that Trump hasn't conceded. He will never concede, but his concession is not necessary to a transition, to a succession. He will be out there, he will be stirring up anger, stirring hatred, stirring division. The whole point of all his lawsuits isn't really to win. The lawsuits are ridiculous. They're being tossed out of court one after another. The point of the lawsuits is so that he can say, you see, it was stolen from us. It's not legitimate. And the hope is that truth can, to some extent, vanquish that myth. The history of the world has shown that myth and conspiracy theories are difficult to vanquish with truth when people live in different realities. So we confront, as has been said, a watershed, whether truth can finally prevail. And I certainly have no answer, but to me, the most wonderful thing about this election is that at least it gives us a reason to struggle again, to hope, because 8 years of this misery would have, I think, doomed the American experiment. We have dodged a terrible bullet. Now we have to take advantage of the opportunity that's been handed to us.
Thanks, Larry. I wanted to now invite Randy or Jim or Val to jump in response to Larry. Randy.
Randy, you've got to unmute.
Thank you very much. I feel much of what Larry feels. I must say, I think I'm probably less hopeful though. I'm in this, I've been feeling like I'm in an emotional whiplash. And on the one hand, what happened was tremendously inspiring. I mean, it brought tears to my eyes to see people standing in long lines with masks on, braving the pandemic in order to vote. I mean, that was really, it was remarkable. And there were some places where people were in lines for long periods of time. And that was great. And what Biden and Harris have done is, you know, they have unseated an incumbent. That's only happened 10 times before in United States history. So, I mean, that what they've accomplished along with the American electorate, or at least a big hunk of the American electorate, was really quite remarkable. Biden-Harris turned 2 states, Arizona, Georgia, and recaptured the so-called blue states in the, you know, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. So what they have done was really quite splendid. And yes, that does give me some degree of solace. On the other hand, over 70 million people voted for Donald Trump. Having seen what he has done, and that makes me angry, that makes me bitter, that makes me deeply fearful. Yeah, I think we have dodged a bullet for the moment, But, you know, we haven't seen what's going to happen with the Senate. The clock runs. 2 years from now, there are midterm elections. Time goes by very quickly. Trump is out, but Trump has really been an educator. There are people who are much smarter than Trump, who've been taking notes. You know, there's a way in which we've been very lucky in the United States and in fact the world. We've been lucky that he was such a gross, stupid, so, you know, he was so conspicuously ignorant. And that, in those sorts of ways, we were lucky.
Mhm.
But there are other people who've been watching what's going on. They're going to be smoother. They're going to be cooler. And, you know, I'm very fearful. I've lived a good life, enjoying the benefits that were pried loose by the civil rights revolution. I have tremendous fear, however, for the country that my children are going to be inheriting. So I hope, Larry, I hope you're right, but I must say I see dark times ahead.
Jim, this, do you want to unmute and respond to Larry and Randy? Dark times ahead, or do we have cause for optimism, Jim?
Well, I'm deeply grateful for the chance to be part of this conversation. I've already been moved deeply by what I've heard. Let me just start with what for me is the largest fact of this moment, which is that Donald Trump is killing us. The pandemic is where it is now, not because of his incompetence, I believe, but because of his deep contempt for human life. And he is now killing us, not just we Americans, but because it's so much a part of the fabric of the world, by allowing the pandemic to run wild the way it's doing now, with no intervention from the United States federal government that matters. Donald Trump is killing us. But I'd step back from that. I do feel obliged to, as a person, as a citizen, to seize this moment of hope, because God knows the election results, far from what we wanted, still represent a tremendous moment of hope for us. And one of the things I think we ought to do is step back and ask the question we haven't allowed ourselves to ask for a long time, which is, where is all of this coming from? And Larry Tribe just said, there is no one answer to such a question. And of course, he's right. Beware the single factor analysis. But I, in my brief remarks right this minute, would like to put on the table what for me is the largest single source of the fear and anger and dark vision that Randy Kennedy just affirmed. And I'm actually with him in spirit with that. I'm frightened for our country and our future. And I just lift up one word: Afghanistan. People will remember, or maybe not, that just before the pandemic broke last January, just before that, something was published in the United States called the Afghanistan Papers. It was an equivalent document to the Pentagon Papers that were published in 1971. It was the laying out of the theretofore secret assessments of the war in Afghanistan by the very people, mostly men, who were responsible for conducting it at the highest levels of government. Interviews of the generals, diplomats, civilian overlords of the American military establishment, interviews with these people going back a couple of years, in which they candidly admitted, as one of them put it, the American people have been consistently lied to. These men have known for years that the war was misbegotten, failed, a catastrophic mistake, and yet it was never presented that way to the American people. More than 40,000 Afghan civilians dead, something approaching 4,500 American troops dead, a vast treasure squandered, and chaos unleashed not just throughout the Middle East, but now across the world, especially Europe, as the refugee waves have destabilized much of the Western world. My question really is, how can we, the American people, have been so blithely indifferent to this unfolding tragedy, which was a result not of any significant national security threat to us, but a result of the apocalyptic panic that overswept us after 9/11. This country became something new after 9/11. And that has been, together with the other factors we're aware of, economic inequality, misbegotten elitism that Michael has written about, the racism that undergirds American culture from the start, still something new has taken hold in this country in the 21st century. And it is a rampant, panicked militarism, the most disturbing aspect of which is that it goes unquestioned. Afghanistan was the good war. Barack Obama ran for president affirming it, opposing it to the bad war, Iraq. Afghanistan was the good war. We were being lied to even when Obama ran for president, promising to win the war in Afghanistan. My friends, forgive me for sounding an all too simplistic note here. The Afghanistan papers barely survived one news cycle. The Pentagon Papers in 1971, by contrast, were a key element in what enabled, indeed forced, the American people to stop cold the escalation of the war in Vietnam. The Pentagon Papers dominated political discourse for the rest of the time the war ran. 1973, the American phase of the war ended. 1975, the Afghanistan Papers were gone before the pandemic hit. And we are still stuck in the morass of the war in Afghanistan. And one of the ironies of the Trump years, of course, is that Trump's incompetence has also been manifest in the way in which he has been incapable of coping with the war in Afghanistan, even to this moment. It may be that he's fired his Secretary of Defense as a prelude to doing something in Afghanistan, who knows? But here's the question: why are the American people excusing themselves from responsibility, not just for the Afghanistan catastrophe, but for the ongoing catastrophe of the American commitment to military solutions around the world? 800 military bases. Who was it? It was Adriana who asked the most important question in this discussion. What is happening in the United States, the US has been promoting in other countries for years. How can the US have democracy, she asked, when the US has done so much to undo democracy? The American commitment to a military stance vis-a-vis the rest of the world is a commitment to undo democracy. And that has poisoned our political imagination across the spectrum, right to left. This problem, in my view, is the root American problem at this moment, undergirding our other problems: racism, elitism, economic inequality, tied to those other problems. American root problem that is still neglected, never discussed by either side in the political campaign we've just completed. Never raised as an issue. When was Afghanistan and all that it represents and all that it comes from raised as a political question in this campaign? It was not. The American people have given themselves a pass on this ongoing, catastrophic moral responsibility that we have.
Thanks, Jim, for putting this important question on the table. Michael wanted to raise a question.
Well, this has been a fascinating set of reflections, and we've only just gotten started. But listening to the observations, I do hear two different threads of interpretation of response to the American election emerging in the comments of those who've commented from abroad, and also the panelists who have just spoken. Some are more hopeful than others. Some, I suppose all of us are breathing a huge sigh of relief that Trump has been defeated by Joe Biden. But I hear differences in interpreting this moment, to what extent this is a hopeful moment, and to what extent this is a possibly temporary reprieve from a condition that is still shadowed by dark clouds. These different sensibilities, these different readings of this moment have been striking, listening to the observations that have been made so far. And I would like to invite people to respond to those competing strands by sharpening, by raising a question that sharpens the question just a little bit. One account we've heard, and Larry articulated it very powerfully, is, but Larry spoke of the transformative potential of this moment, of the hopeful trajectory that American democracy seemed to be on through the Obama years, that was suddenly interrupted in 2016 by the election of Donald Trump. And the hopeful scenario is that now that Trump has been defeated and Biden elected, we can resume and can expect to resume the hopeful trajectory that Trump interrupted. There's another reading of this moment that I hear in some of the other comments, which is not only less optimistic, but that also suggests a different interpretive frame for how the Trump interruption, if it wasn't, how the Trump interruption arose in the first place. And the question I would like to put to the group is this. Should we view the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and here, I mean, Randy pointed out, there is still the fact, the looming fact, the irreducible fact that 70 million people, after all we've been through, 70 million people wanted to give Trump another 4 years. And as Cynthia McCauley reported from Trump country in the Florida Panhandle, Trump supporters have dug in even more deeply. The question is this: should we understand the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as an opportunity to restore, a moment of restoration of a hopeful trajectory? Or is the centrist liberalism represented by Biden and by Obama before him and Hillary Clinton in between, and by Bill Clinton before them, is that centrist liberalism perhaps not the hopeful trajectory it seemed at the time, but rather flawed in a way that paved the way to Trump? Deciding what we think about this question may go a long way toward interpreting not only what's likely to come next, but what we should strive for next. And by we, I mean everyone from those who voted for the Democratic Party in this election, to those who are demonstrating in the streets in the Black Lives Matter movement protests, and the other street demonstrations that Bukala asked about. So how should we view this moment as between these two interpretive
Can I?
frames?
Michael, I actually wanted to, oh, I'm sorry.
All right, go ahead, Val.
Yeah,
I
Val.
just wanted to jump in because I didn't get a chance to.
Yeah. You want
I
to?
was calling you,
question.
yes, so that's perfect.
Yeah, so my question, as far as the panel question, was really related to what your question is, Michael, so it ties in well, because I think that part of the concern with the hope that some people feel with the Biden-Harris administration is an assumption that going back to the pre-Trump status quo is a good thing. And that going back to the pre-Trump status quo is the solution, and that Trump has really been this poison that somehow infiltrated the US system, and it's kind of the bad apple theory, right? But I think to your point, at least from my perspective, for the people, I would say, who have been historically the most marginalized in the US, African Americans and Native Americans, things were pretty bad under Democratic presidents as well. And under those presidents, the people who, I'm sorry, Cynthia, I know that you love and work with these people, but who I don't consider particularly disenfranchised, felt very disenfranchised and unseen, right? Which is what caused Trump, that white people who felt like perhaps they were being talked down to by a political elite and felt like nobody cared about grassroots white Americans anymore, felt disenfranchised by Democrats, while mostly Black people and Native Americans were being disenfranchised by Democrats. And so I think one question to add to what you're asking, Michael, is when we talk about moving forward, is it possible to reform the systems that will be in place under Biden-Harris, hopefully if this goes through, or do we need to delete them, right, and start anew, given that those systems are based on America's long history of racism that comes out in different ways through both the Democratic Party and the Trump Party. And the more centrist the Democratic Party gets, right, the more we see those kinds of injustices proliferate. And I think that this goes to Jim's point as well, because I do think that it is a huge mistake to behave as if, the American injustices, both locally and in the world, began with Trump. So I would just want to put that on the table and add that to Michael's call to the rest of the group.
Could I speak to that?
Go ahead.
Please.
Actually, I agree very much with both Val and Jim, although I'm not sure I agree with Jim entirely about the degree to which Afghanistan has causative explanatory power. I tend to believe that it is not a choice between two frames, although of course in caricature, one could see it either as entirely hopeful, and I think that would be wrong, or one could think of entirely dark times ahead, and that too would be wrong. I think merely going back to the status quo ante is clearly not enough. We were not addressing the deepest injustices of American society. We were not addressing structural racism. We were not addressing the problems of white working middle class people who also were left behind. We were not addressing massive inequalities. The triangulation of Clinton and the attempt to be reasonable in almost all things to all people on the part of Obama was not enough. That's why I feel at least encouraged that Biden, whom I have known and liked for years, will be getting a lot of pressure from his left. Kamala Harris will make an important contribution. There are people who recognize that unless a much more progressive tack is taken, unless we don't simply restore the status quo ante, pretending that it was all terrific, but dig deeper and more foundationally, the dark undercurrent that caused the Trump eruption will be enhanced. That is, Trump was not simply an aberration, he was a symptom of all sorts of difficulties. And that's why Biden has tried with this somewhat vanilla slogan, I suppose, of Build Back Better to indicate that he is committed to something other than going back to a smooth trajectory. What I had in mind in talking about that trajectory was that we were beginning, though only beginning, to recognize some of those deep problems. We hadn't done enough to deal with them. Then Trump comes along and speaks to the feeling of disenfranchisement by people who aren't nearly as disenfranchised as those whom Val was talking about. And I think in that sense, we have received from the Trump presidency a valuable education. That's where I agree with Randy. On the one hand, yes, he has educated the smarter demagogues who are waiting in the wings. He has taught them all kinds of things about how the big lie works, not only in Germany, but in America. All kinds of things about how they can manipulate the system. But we have also learned from him. That's where I agree with people like Anne Applebaum and Gary Kasparov, who are formed something called the Renew Democracy Initiative. We should regard ourselves as lucky that this most demagogic and duplicitous and gross of presidents has been as inept as he has, because we have gotten a taste of what a dictator might look like. Just add about 80 IQ points and a smarter set of people around him, and we will really have trouble. But because we have seen what some of the mechanisms are, I think we can, with people like Masha Gessen and Tim Snyder of Yale, recognize that when a would-be autocrat speaks, we have to believe him. We have to believe not the lies he tells to the cult he leads, but we have to believe the aspirations that he openly describes to be all-powerful, to have his own Article 2, which allows him to do anything. We have to recognize the weakness of our institutions, the weakness of the institutions that are marred by gerrymandering, by the Electoral College, by a vulnerable electoral system, although happily it was not penetrated this time as much as it might have been. And we can learn from those weaknesses. We need, therefore, and I agree, we are not likely to have it unless we manage to win those 2 Senate seats in Georgia. We need a fully progressive program that is committed to reforming our democratic institutions, strengthening them against a lawless autocrat and an oligarch like Trump. So though I expressed hope, it was certainly not a sense that all was fine, all was great. Trump was an aberration, we just need to go on. That wasn't my thought.
Thank you, Larry. I want to go to Vidya Krishnan. Vidya, unmute yourself. Vidya is one of the new Neiman Fellows and reports from India. So comment or question, Vidya.
I spent the last 3 years reporting on the Rohingya genocide, and I have also been covering the conflict in Kashmir and now on the border of Bangladesh and India, where concentration camps are coming up as we speak to house newly disenfranchised minorities like Indian Muslims. My question is, if there is a legal solution here, after having seen the American election, what struck me was the election integrity tools that were included by social media platforms, and like fact checking and misinformation, which was flagged. And my question is that Facebook was the organizing tool for the Rohingya genocide. The Burmese military used Facebook to organize and ethnically cleanse the community. And I wonder if there are legal solutions to start. I guess I'm asking is, if we care for democracy, to me it seems like legally there are quantifiable and solvable. This seems like a solvable problem if we started with Facebook and Twitter. I wonder what you think.
All right. Well, the role of social media and the possible legal solutions is an important question that we can come back to. But I want first to bring in Marc-Olivier Barrère, who is an opinion writer for Le Monde and covers culture for Le Monde, who had, I think, an observation or a comment on this question about hope, shadows, restoration or otherwise. Can we hear, Marc-Olivier, what you wanted to say about that?
Hi, thank you, Michael. Yes, indeed, I would like to answer your question. Or is it a moment of restoration for centrism, liberalism, or maybe a new trajectory should be found? I think, like in 2016, when Trump was elected, many observers said, well, this is the end of the liberal order, and it is indeed over. There's no going back. The liberal order was at three pillars, if you want. It was growth, it was a strong American, a strong presence of the U.S. Abroad through its military apparatus, and it was also a propagation of human rights. It was not always true, but it was a general understanding of what it was. And indeed, there were many failures of that, and quite often the promises were not met in real life. We know nowadays that growth doesn't really happen, and when it happens, there's no real redistribution of the riches produced. The U.S. is not as powerful as it used to be. The Afghanistan war stands as proof, and there's no more consensus on the world stage to advance human rights. You know, Angela Merkel said so. I think a year ago, when she said, well, when it was the anniversary of the Human Rights Declaration at the UN, she said, well, if we would try that today, I'm not sure we would be able to advance such an agenda. So I think we're past that. Now, does it mean that we should give up on liberalism? I'm not sure. Liberalism as a philosophy is not moderation. It's not necessarily centrism. It's not equal to liberalism. Liberalism is placed at the foremost, the respect of the dignity of the individuals. But to make such a case for the individual, it means that sometimes liberalism adopts a schmug attitude. Well, if your job was lost due to globalization, just get an education. It's your problem, not mine. It also means that, well, maybe you're part of those minorities, but you should be happy that you have at least freedom. You're not living in a communist country. There's this schmug attitude sometimes that comes with liberalism. However, within this tradition, there are some thinkers that help us think this moment through. And I'm thinking here of Judith Shklar, who used to be, when she was alive, was a teacher, a professor here at Harvard. In our books on cruelty, where she investigate the idea of cruelty, how it is the worst of it. How should we prevent the worst? She was exploring this idea in the context of totalitarianism. We should explore it in a broader way, and to make sure that everybody's dignity is not limited by any experience of cruelty. And yeah, thank you. That was the point I wanted to make.
Thank you for those powerful points. And I want to call on Austin. Forgive me if I give me the last name so I can pronounce it correctly.
Oops.
Yes. So give us your view, your response.
Oh, I didn't know if I had so much a response. I had more of a question, if that's okay.
Sure.
But I'm a Nieman Fellow. I'm studying polarization this year at Harvard, and I'm guessing one of the things I'm just, there's such a big divide in terms of how we view just the last election, and even our experiences in America. There's been so much discussion in terms of how do we dial down the temperature in our national dialogue and form some actual constructive dialogue. And I'm just curious to hear from the group in terms of that. But if I'm not mistaken, had we answered Vidya's question? I think she had answered a question beforehand. I don't know if it was ever actually answered, so I just didn't know if we could come back to that first.
All right, so we've got. Thank you for reminding us of that. So we have.
Thanks, Austin.
We have both the question still about social media and what can be done about it legally and otherwise. And then we have to go back to Austin's question about polarization, which connects with where Gwen actually began us with this provocative question, whether anger, which is both a source of energy and addiction, Gwen said, is something we want to get rid of in our politics or not, quite apart from whether we can. That connects with what Austin has asked about polarization. But is there someone who would like to address the question about social media? Is there someone who has views about that?
Well, I have views, but I've spoken too much, I think. So
Go ahead, Larry.
I'll wait to see if anyone else wants to talk about Facebook and Twitter and how to avoid the silo effect and especially the spreading of manifest untruth. I just won't say any more until others have spoken.
Okay, is there anyone else who would like to address Vidya's question?
My name is Hong. I'm a former Niemann's Fellow 2012. And I used to work at YouTube, so I was on the startup team as an engineer building YouTube in 2006, 2010. And as an engineer, I had no clue how to set up a governance system to enhance and improve the dialogue and the discourse on something like that, because I never really was educated. But now I'm taking Professor Sandel's class and I'm doing many other things at HKS to learn how to do it better if I was given a chance in the future. One thing that I'm realizing is, as a Nieman Fellow, I learned that journalists do have this editorial power and responsibility, whereas the tech companies have no experience, and they're writing algorithms that might not be effective, and they know they're not effective because they have humans, tens and thousands of humans moderating this. So in a way, I think Vidya's point is really that Facebook and Twitter ends up having to pop up these editorial teams, maybe for every country, for every big event. And that's probably their own solution, practically speaking, because the AI is not intelligent enough to play that role as an editor. So then the next question is from a governance and legal perspective. I hope someone in this room will be able to help us explain how to actually set that in motion. Is it a Supreme Court for Facebook, or is there something that's legally from a government entity that can help activate and operationalize this?
Go ahead, Bukola. You have to unmute.
Unmute, Bukola.
I actually didn't have a response to that, but I can talk to Vidya's point. Yeah. I think I've been looking at a lot of tweets from Trump for the past 2-3 years or since he's been president. And I felt like tech companies needed to act more swiftly than they have done. They waited for the election to come around before flagging down a lot of his tweets that were basically lies. And I think that there's a lot of there's need for accountability in that tech space on how to just how to just get and cut through a lot of noise coming from a lot of political leaders. It's not just Trump, but he has really showed how you can work social media and raise a lot of armies to or against anybody. So that would be my feedback. That would be my feedback to that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I want to thank you for that. And I wonder if we could put this question to Kiku, you've written a lot about the media and the manipulation of the media through images and otherwise.
Before Kiku comes in.
Who is that, Speciosa?
Yes, please.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Yes. Sometimes I feel that the academia is cheating the population in every country. Because
cheating.
All that cheating.
Yeah.
Not giving back. The role of agency, when you do your research, you actually talk to yourselves, and you don't give back to the population. To the extent that the anger which I have also experienced as a political activist and gone to the streets, is because of lack of information, really information which is well researched. Most people, if you consistently give them information and they identify that you are unbiased, you are neither Democrat or Republican or DP or UPC or whatever, they will listen to you. So I think part of the solution would be to use this wonderful information technology so that the academia can actually keep bombarding the population with information in a language they understand. Because sometimes the language which is used by the professors is very abstract and it does not talk to what the population is really interpreting in their own way. Otherwise, to me, in fact, we are having campaigns here and I had to go to do some conflict resolution within the party, my party, and the young people were saying, you are not talking to us. When you talk to them and they raise their issues, they say, we didn't know. We actually do not know what is going on. So at the height of politicking, when everybody, I want to tell you, as we discuss here, if you've been a politician looking for votes, it's like you are possessed by something. And you are possessed to the extent that you don't even need to sleep. And when it's all over, that's it. And once people give you the mandate, you know they've listened to you. For me, I see the problem in America is that you have not solved, the problem has been laid bare, like has been said. As a surgeon, I'm a happy person because waiting to see, like you did when Trump was treating, was not leading you anywhere. But now the wound is open. Whether the incision was a bit to the left or to the right of the midline is immaterial. The disease has been laid bare. And I think part of the solution would be for Americans to identify who is it that, it's not even the two sides, because some people wouldn't vote for either the Democrats or the Republicans. You have to, the Americans have to identify those issues that bring them together, and they make them the agenda for the country, for the federal states. Each state will have its own unique problems, but what is it that they want as America? And the rest of the world is looking while other powers are coming up. Maybe it's better that Trump said, let's look and see how do we make America great again? Because we can see you are really bare. Inside, you are not as smart or as clean as you make the whole world to see. So to me, anger is a wonderful thing during election time. It makes people wake up and they listen. Secondly, it's not the institutions or the politicians who prescribe what it is that is the best for a country. It is the people themselves, because each of them in their own way experiences things differently. But together they can sit and agree, yes, this is our common experience and this is what we can in common address. So to me, Biden has a very big problem. There is no solution yet. And it's not, you know, people always say political will. The political will is not in the president or the vice president. It is in the researchers, the leaders at every level. That young man who was saying that as an engineer, he would really be very willing to see what to do. In Africa, we are telling the women that nobody is going to do this to solve the problem for you. You must be a conflict resolver, whether you are a teacher, an engineer, an agriculturist, a sweeper, everywhere you are going to be a leader, so that together we know that the onus of keeping our country together or our continent together lies within each of us. Otherwise, America, two parties only, you don't even talk about other views or ideas, and yet they are there. and yet you claim to be a democratic country. So I think to me, before you come in with IT is a tool, but what is the essence of what it is conveying to the population? It is a tool, it is a vehicle. What is the essence of what you feel you are and what you want to be? Are you going to remain to continue with the narrative of African Americans, Latinos, and that kind of thing? It is the same in Uganda. We have 43 tribes. Some can be called Latinos, others can be called African Americans, all those kind of things. So really, it is now time for America to sit back and truly diagnose what is making the iceberg stable, so that every now and again, the boat rocks the way it has erupted, and now it has erupted. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Speciosa, for that powerful statement. And I think that it turns us very profoundly to the essence of democracy, as Speciosa says, who has worked in the streets, both as a protester, as I said earlier, against dictatorship, Idi Amin, and then rising to power and working in this very grassroots, local level for transformation. And I think that this turns us to the social movements in our country that are working in that respect. Under the Trump administration, we had two big social movements, Me Too, which a lot of us already are forgetting because, again, this constant loss of memory with the Trump focus in the US and with the US media. And of course, Black Lives Matter and the consideration of other movements, other social democratic movements, socialist movements, the work that Bernie Sanders did, bringing a lot of young people into the political process. And I think it is true fundamentally, I think it's a very profound point, that we have to look at the base of the people and to take things to the people, getting back to a framework that Michael developed in his latest book, The Tyranny of Merit. There is a problem on both sides, both among Republicans and Democrats, of elitist top-down politics in which certain politicians or experts as the authority are debating. And on the news, I think I'm very critical of the way the American media has failed to reach the people, because we have a bunch of talking heads who are offering their opinions to each other in a very small room. When Speciosa was talking about the insularity of academia, similarly with the media, we have this 24/7 media coverage, and it's an incessant, high-pitched, hyperactive, breaking news, breaking news, breaking news, and we're in an incessant present without an opportunity to reflect or even turn our gaze to the people of this country and the movements that are shaping the democratic process as it is today.
Gwen, can we bring you back, because we've been talking about social media and its corrosive effect on democracy. You led the most important broadcast radio media in Britain, and yet you've observed the coarsening of coverage, not only in social media with its vitriol and conspiracy theories, but also you've cast an eye across at the US and the kind of cable news coverage that we're afflicted with. What would be your answer?
Well, there's a lot to say. I just think, if I can just go back in a way to the sort of big question, Michael, I agree, it's impossible to pick up where things were before. The world's changed, even in terms of the media, in terms of the different bubbles people are in. The world has changed. It's different. We're in, I think, a sort of post-Enlightenment world now where we know we can't assume a consensus on the sort of logic and science. It's going to be part of the way people see and interpret the world. Thinking what Cynthia said, which I think was so powerful, looking at the sun, we all see something different. Well, we can't possibly assume that we have the one answer to all that as a sort of liberal elite that was there before. And looking at America and whether this is reflected in the media, I don't think it is. But you know, the idea of the sort of Arcadian liberal era cruelly cut short, as it were, by Trump, it just isn't right. It's not right anywhere, but certainly in America, you know, there's so much to be done. We've observed the sort of savage, brutal racial hatreds that seems to have that has a real hold on your country. Highest incarceration rate, the worst medical provision for the poor of any rich society, it would probably be accurate to say. It's a sort of massive, there are so many issues to address, and these can be done really by, I think Kiku was right, it's a matter of listening and being much more engaged with the populations. And this is where the media needs to be as well, around and about, reporting from the grassroots, telling, so that people are better informed and have better knowledge. I think really the challenge is great. And Sergio also said, to what extent will the US populism have on countries around the world? So don't forget that the impact of America is still great on countries around the world. I mean, we have, you know, a real collection of mini Trumps all around the place in Central and East Europe, all over the place now. So this is not going to go away. It's a task now to find a new way forward that is positive and gives respect to people.
Thanks, Gwen.
We still have hanging the question that we haven't quite fully addressed, that Bukola raised about translating the energy of the protests, the Black Lives Matter movement and other street protests against injustice, into action. And this actually is under the broad heading of hope, which we've been discussed, and many of the speakers have discussed the question, how hopeful a moment is this? Is there someone who has thoughts about that, about translating the hope and the energy and the activism of the protests, including the Black Lives Matter movement, into sustained action and policy? Or are we destined to have two separate tracks to politics? What goes on in civil society and social movements on the one hand, and what goes on in government on the other? Is there anyone who would like to address that question?
Michael, if I may?
Yeah.
I would love to speak up on this a little bit by starting with saying, I think it's the latter. I have very little hope, at least in the United States, for translating the current social movements into sustained political action. And I think the reason for that is that I think the current social movements, especially when we're talking about Black Lives Matter, are asking for things that are much too radical for the current American political players. And I don't think, I think the way to translate it, I agree that it would be in elections, as Professor Tribe had mentioned, and that it would be, you know, through our political system. But I think that in 2020, we are not in a place in the US where we have enough people who would choose political leaders that are progressive enough that the demands being made by the Black Lives Matter movement would ever be translated into more than people on the street, unless there were some kind of revolution. When it was Trump versus Biden, and Biden being such a centrist Democrat, for that to be such a close election, I think tells us that we are not in a place in the US for us to elect officials, enough of us to elect officials, that they would actually consider any of the demands, like a real abolishing of the police, or any of the demands. You know, we're in a place where we're still on both sides not acknowledging that 5 Black men being lynched like a month ago is a lynching. Both sides are reporting those as suicides. There have been at least 5 lynchings of Black men hanging from trees, and both sides of the media are reporting those as suicides, which is insane when you think of the history of this country. So I would say I actually don't believe there is a path right now for that.
And if I could add to my wife's point, I believe we might be experiencing a phase where, in fact, this might cause even more resentment on both sides, particularly in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement. There is a tendency by capitalism in particular to take over the trend, what businesses see as a PR trend. And without the government or without politics truly addressing the legitimate grievances associated with that movement. And so it's on TV, it's in sports, it's in the streets, it's in signs everywhere, but there's no actual, at least currently, there's no actual response to those grievances from a political standpoint. Mm-hmm. And on the other side, that cultural trend, PR trend, is very visible. And so it might further fuel resentment, both illegitimate, I believe illegitimate resentment against those grievances.
Great, I want to go to Randy and then Adriana for perspectives on the power of social movements and this powerful point that Val made of it's going to be difficult to look to traditional party politics in the US. Randy, unmute.
Yeah, again, I feel so torn. On the one hand, there's much that, I mean, what Val said really resonates with me. Think about this summer in the George Floyd moment. I mean, there were hundreds of thousands of people in the street. You listen to the radio, there were people who really had a sense that this was the moment, that this was going to be a real turning point. You know, we had been here before and there'd been disappointments before, but there was this real feeling that this is different. This is different. I mean, people were saying that. Well, I mean, if you go to the administration of criminal justice, if you go to, the question of police reform, look at what's happening now. There has actually been rollback. The tremendous feeling of relief, excitement, exultation. Look at Minnesota. Look at Minneapolis itself. There has been a tremendous feeling of disappointment, and one wonders, well, gosh, you had Bloomingdale's talking about Black Lives Matter. You had Amazon everybody was talking about Black Lives Matter at that moment. And then in just a few months, I mean, moving things is just so remarkably difficult. I'm not talking about moving things a couple of yards. I'm talking about moving things an inch. It's extraordinary. I mean, fervor is no match for the inertia of bureaucracies. And I think that has really come home. And so what Val says really strikes home with me, but I will say this on the other hand, Val, because I'm with you actually. I mean, I start off, I see darkness. I mean, I'm really actually quite dejected. But here is one thing that, thank goodness, holds me up. In 1860, who would have thought that by 1865, slavery would be done in the United States? Who would have thought in 1865 that 5 years later, just 5 years later, the former slaves would be electors? Who would have thought that the person who would succeed Jefferson Davis resigned his seat in the United States Senate to be the president of the Confederate States of America, the champions of slavery? They lost. Who took his seat? the first Black man to be in Congress, Hiram Revels. And who would have thought that Barack Obama would have been president of the United States? When I used to teach affirmative action in my course on race relations law at Harvard Law School, people would talk about, well, how long do you want affirmative action? And as a joke, people would say, oh, we want it until there's a Black president. Well, for 8 years, there was a Black president. It wasn't enough, obviously, but for people like me, you know, who'd have thunk it? So keep hope alive.
I'm trying. Thanks, Professor Kennedy. I'm trying.
Adriana.
Yeah, no, I agree completely with Val as well. And I think when I hear that the closeness of some of the races in the House and the Senate, and even for president, that the races were so close because their leftist side of the Democrats were pushing too hard for radical reforms, it really makes me lose entirely hope. Because as soon, like Sergio says, there is a disconnect between the PR of Black Lives Matter and the movement itself, and the need, the urgency to put it at the central stage of what needs to be changed and done right now. And I think Biden has to make it a central aspect of his presidency. But moreover, I think it does need to include, if it's going to be a real movement with some influence on the legislature, I think it will have to bring people from the movement, people from the street, people from the communities. And if they don't, then it's going to be like what Michael has been saying, this panel of experts. I think we have to do away with that and in effect include people from the streets and to make them part of governing boards and to make decisions for the people. I think that the only way to go back to democracy is really not by making legislation, but by including the real people on the ground, and to really give them political weight to their opinions and to their needs.
Adriana, I had a follow-up question for you. You've given a lot of thought to the Latino vote in the United States. And when Speciosa raised the question and about the people and how we reach people, we have a problem, I think, in the United States of putting people into very big amorphous blocks like Latino vote. And then the Democrats don't understand, well, look, what happened to the Latino vote or the Black vote? Can you break it down for us a little bit? To many Americans, the surprising results of this election, that in Trump got about, what, 40% of
30-something percent.
30-something percent.
30, yeah.
But in
32%.
places
But in Texas,
like
it was 41%.
Yes, and in the border area of Texas, El Paso, 50%. Just in the spirit of Speciosa's earlier question, we have to think more about the people. Who are the people of the United States? Break it down for us a little bit about why it's a misnomer to lump all people, so-called Latino, having that category.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that one of the issues, of course, the Latino vote, as now many journalists have pointed out, it's not a monolith. It's a very large group, and it puts together people whose origins come from 21 different countries at least, and different generations and different histories depending on the part of the country where they are located. So in Florida, the Cubans and now the people from Venezuela are usually much more conservative. They come from Cuba and Venezuela, and they tend to be the ones that are here. They lean politically to the right, And there's also, for the Cubans especially, there have been many generations of Cubans. The first wave came with the Cuban Revolution in 1959. And so you are seeing the children and the grandchildren of those immigrants who have very much identified with American life and American capitalism, and they hate anything that is related to socialism. The same thing is happening to Venezuelans, and also because the people who emigrate, at least to the US, tend to come from the upper classes and middle upper classes. Not all of them. Whereas that is a big contrast from the people who have emigrated from Mexico, or who were there before Texas and Arizona and New Mexico were part of the US, who were crossed by the border. And those people have been there for many, many generations. And I think that there's also the need to assimilate to American culture. And that brings an odd identification with anti-immigrant postures, that some of the most anti-immigrants are relatively recent immigrants, but not immediately, but second or third generation. And then there's the Central American immigration population, which is smaller, but still the numbers are high, which are located in areas where there is a lot of racism and a lot of rejection of diversity in the Midwest and now in the Dakotas. And those people have experienced a lot of racism, and they tend to lean Democrats. So I think that there are many groups and many generations, and we have to take that into account. Just like any major political group, you cannot lump them as one culture, one identity, and there are white Latinos, Black Latinos, brown Latinos, and each group has a different relationship also depending on the place where they came to live. So it's not the same to be a Latino in Texas than in South Dakota, in Louisiana, than in California. So I think that the term in itself was invented in the 70s, and it was a census term. It was Hispanics. And it was some bureaucrat who said, how should we call the people who come from Latin America mostly and who speak Spanish? And they call them Hispanics. With the years, there was backlash against the term precisely because it put a stress on the Hispanic, on the colonial aspect of the immigration. So they chose Latino, but again, Latino, it's a male, it's a masculine noun. So Latinx became the chosen form. But so because you have so many, it's a huge group, and it has so much diversity within itself. I think that what the politicians have to do, and in general Americans, is to get to know more the diversity of this group and how different its constituents are.
That's great. What we want to do now for the last 20 minutes is open up the discussion to people who haven't had a chance to speak yet from different parts of the world and people who've been assembled here. Maybe to start it off, Elizabeth Westling, you want to jump into the conversation? You're a historian and a landscape architect, so what do you think in terms of the last points that were made?
Thank you so much. This has been an absolutely phenomenal discussion, and I'm so grateful to be included. I'm not sure I have any overarching or bigger point to make, but I do think on a very small scale, looking at what each one can do, not part of a big group, but just as an individual. You can try always to keep your mind as open as possible, read as widely as you can, and that let your curiosity take you in all manner of directions. And also just have a kindness and a care for everyone that you encounter, even if you don't like them, even if they're raging and being nasty against you. Sometimes just extending your hand in friendship and generosity in the smallest of things in life is what can turn a person around.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
That's all I have.
International feel, I want to go to Cengiz, a former student of Michael's. Cengiz, I think you're in Denmark now, but you're originally from Turkey, right?
Yes.
Talk to us.
Of course. I'd like to speak a little bit about the symbolic dimensions of the American election. I've been speaking, and I work as an anthropologist right now at a strategy consultancy. So we speak and go around the world, and of course pre-COVID, and right now over Zoom, with a lot of people and speak to them about their experiences and how they think about their lives and what their potentialities are, and all of that type of stuff. And what has been really fascinating lately, I think post-election especially, right? With Donald Trump's this election, in a way, a lot of the populations I feel in Turkey and around the world, in countries in Belarus and Moldova that have kind of past heritage of some form of dictatorial regimes or some kind of authoritarian power rule, are seeing that it is possible to eradicate. It is possible through democratic or undemocratic means to use some methods to actually hope for some kind of a democratic approach. I'm using very vague language because they are themselves using very vague language. And it just reminds me, I think this whole period, pre-election and post-election, and through my conversations with all my respondents, have reminded me again and again, as much as kind of the maybe youthful 21st century post-colonial narrative tries to detach United States from the rest of the world and say, you know, we are whatever developing countries or institutions and societies that are independent from what the first world does or thinks about or what the West enforces on its own societies. But it's sadly and gladly deeply connected, meaning what happens in America and what types of elections and what type of individuals run the institutions and country, that has very direct correlations and connotations to how people in the rest of the world then think about whether they can one day turn their own societies into a democratic one or not. And I feel sad that most of my American peers are losing sight of that connection. Because this year has been such an insular one for Americans, so much of the focus has been on what has been going on in America. And the Western news have been jumping from topic to topic, right? Anything that like Belarusian protests, which is a historical moment in their national history, has taken coverage maybe for a couple days in a given week and then moved on. Or the oppression of Xinjiang Muslims in China, right? It's a unprecedented historical moment that can be compared in its colossal kind of size to Holocaust in many, many ways. And we as a globe are silent and are moving on with our lives because we're not allowed to critique China because of whatever business relations we might have with them or potential future travel opportunities, et cetera, regardless. I could talk about this for a decade.
Thanks, Cengiz. Mishi Harman in Israel. Mishi, are you with us?
Okay.
Unmute.
Okay. Nadav.
Nadav, another of our former student in Israel. Nadav, are you with us?
I am. Can you all see me?
Yeah, I can.
Great. Thank you, Kiku. Good to see you again. And thank you, everyone, for the conversation and your insights. I think just briefly from my perch here in Tel Aviv, and I work for the UN here, the Office of the UN Special Coordinator, I wanted to try and suggest another layer to the question that Michael asked earlier on the trajectory of liberalism. And also the question that Val addressed in terms of, you know, what can we expect social movements to lead to in the current political reality? And that layer is the question of the foreign policy of a Biden administration. I think based on what you hear from within the UN system, based on what you hear from leaders on the ground here, those immersed in policy around the Middle East, there are massive expectations regarding US re-engagement on the world stage, reinvigorating global institutions, championing multilateralism. But at the same time, many of the signals that you're getting from sort of the Biden campaign or the discourse in the US are modest. They are talking about returning to the world stage and global leadership, but the policy is one of reversion to the mean, of going back more or less to the policy of the Obama administration, and in some ways not even quite as ambitious as that administration was in its early days. And I think this stems from a sensibility that I can understand that says that there's polarization in the US, and given the political realities there, and given the global polarization, one needs to set one's sight on achievable and modest goals. And so the question I'm grappling with, and the question I kind of would pose to the group in this context is, are we at a moment where the most effective, the most optimistic we can be is simply drilling down and reinforcing the global institutions we have, strengthening a liberal order, a rules-based order, so that when the time comes, and it undoubtedly will, that order is there to protect minorities, that order is there to protect rights, it's there to do what it was built to do? Or have recent years proven that what we need is actually an ambitious policy, is actually exercising those institutions right now to accomplish something, to demonstrate that they're there for a purpose, and it's of the utmost urgency to do that quickly. And I think that's a real question that I think the Biden administration will have to ask itself, and I think all of us as sort of citizens of the world who care about it functioning is one that we need to address too. So just something to pose to the group.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nadav. And I want to turn to Nicholas Prevalakis and then to Peter Davis. Nicholas, coming from Greece, part of the Hellenic Center at Harvard. We're drawing near to the end, so you're brief, but always astute points on.
Super brief. I actually had a conversation with some Greek journalists this morning on the impact of the American elections, and not surprisingly, of course, in Greece, the main question is, what does it mean for Greece-Turkish relations, as opposed to, you see, the questions that we're asking here today, and will Biden be more critical towards Turkey than Trump has been? But more broadly, going back to Michael's initial point, about the liberal centrist consensus and whether or not it's in crisis. The comparison here with the European Union, I think, is a good one. The European Union, of course, is a different entity. It's not a federal state like the United States. It's a kind of union of nation states, but it has lived with this problem of this liberal centrist, technocratic, elitist rule, accused of lacking democratic legitimacy very often. And there, of course, the outcomes have been different than in the United States. Not one big takeover by some kind of authoritarian or wannabe authoritarian leader, but things that pop up occasionally. So Orban in Hungary almost we got the extreme right in the second in the presidential elections as a number 2 candidate in twice, 2002 and then more recently. Extreme right neo-Nazi party rising in Greece a couple of years ago. Sometimes this Brexit, of course, and so I think it's a good comparison in looking at these ways in which this consensus crumbles and then survives or doesn't survive. That's all I had to as an observation.
Thank you, Nicholas. I want to go to Peter Davis. And Peter is really special to us because he did an incredible film, which I know I showed our sons more recently. It was a film about a documentary that won an Academy Award called Hearts and Minds. Somehow it ties so deeply into our discussion and to earlier points that Speciosa and others raised about talking to people and understanding where they are, trying to understand at the time the Vietnam conflict. But Peter, I know you want to probably raise a question or a point about something else, but I thought of you during this discussion. Just unmute and speak to us.
Okay, I hope I'm unmuted now.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. Right from the start, from the earliest speakers from England and Africa, I got the impression, and I have everything that everybody else has said reinforces that impression, that the world has a worse plague right now than COVID, and nobody's even looking for a vaccine. And the plague, quite simply, is anger. And that's what you talked about as being addictive, Gwyneth, when you began. And this has been echoed. I was really glad. I was about to say I want to agree with, I want to not agree, rather, with Randy Kennedy, but I do agree with your pessimism. And thank goodness at the end you said something a little bit more optimistic. But it seems to me that what the 24/7 news cycle and social media does is it robs us of both memory and anticipation. And so we're left with this plague of anger, and which is addictive, as Gwyneth said, and I don't know how we get over it. Cynthia, I also wanted to say, I wish we had one of your friends here, somebody who does believe on the other side, and even a very smart conservative like Justice Amy Barrett. I wish we had one of them in this conversation, because without them, we are left with just this addiction on their side as well as on ours. And I'm reminded, because of the 24/7 cycle, and then I'll be quiet, of Hannah Arendt's insight in her book about Eichmann in Jerusalem, The Banality of Evil. Pretty soon, we don't even notice it anymore. So yes, as Jim Carroll said, Trump has killed lots and lots of Americans and other people around the world because of his attitude towards COVID. But what do we do about this addiction to anger? How do we break that? Thanks.
And as Peter eloquently said, we have no vaccine for it. What a remarkable discussion. Kiku, a concluding remark?
Yes, first of all, I want to thank everyone at this big virtual table. Let's just say we're hopeful in that way, that even though we couldn't gather together around one table, we've gathered together around this table and had a very frank and open conversation on the point, so many points that Peter raised, helping to sum up. On the point of anger, there is something that keeps us apart, as Cynthia was saying, life in Panama City. It still goes on. People are still loving each other and knitted together and having the anger. At her Chautauqua school, there are staff, a lot of staff that are Trump supporters and some that are not, like Cynthia, but they work together still. But I want to raise, as in point of summary, Speciosa's point about the animating and powerful effect of anger and rage that can, if summoned in the right way, inspire people to protest and inspire people, as Larry and Randy were saying, is going beyond just the streets and feeling that somehow if I'm out there, if I'm angry, and if I'm protesting, that will be enough, that it has to translate into action. It has to translate, as Val and Adriana, and I know we've heard this a lot in our discussions, of really a deep political transformation. And I think looking at people and being able to cultivate, which is the best way to change the situation of this fractious dialogue, is to cultivate more of the art of listening and to see the dignity of our opponents and the respect their point of view. That doesn't mean that we agree. And if we were to go deeper, even in this discussion, we would find disagreements, but to listen to it and speak to each other. And this is where it gets back to the points many have made about grassroots organizing. And Speciosa was talking about the politician that goes door to door and in the street and dancing with people and hanging out with people. She was called the dancing vice president in Uganda. So, going out to the clubs and everywhere else. Thanks to everybody. It was a wonderful discussion, and tune in. We will gather all of you together soon for another. Take care, and thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What is for dessert?